important. Just really quickly, so I remember, you are all educators of some sort, right? So some of you teach, some of you, I heard someone say they work for a museum, NCAR's education program. Is that right, Katie? Okay.
Yeah, if not educators, educator supporters, or informal educators. Yep.
Cool. And I think this is the North America group. I apologize in advance that most of what I'm going to say is focused on the United States. That's not to knock Canada. I'm actually from Canada. I grew up in Montreal.
And there is a Canada cohort this year, so we don't have any
Oh,
Canadians
they're okay.
in our
Last year you
group.
had
So
Canadians.
we are pretty well the US based here today too. So that
okay,
actually
perfect. So no apology needed, but as Canadian, I have to apologize even when it's not necessary. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. Some motivation. Why do I study this? Some facts about US political polarization that I think are important for understanding some of the results that I'm going to show you. Some facts about climate change polarization. Some overview of my research on climate change polarization and where I think it suggests opportunities for bipartisanship and opportunities that I think are growing, which is good. Where we're already seeing, I think, some seeds of bipartisan climate solutions at the state and recently at the federal level, and then some strategies for having better conversations. In addition to researching this topic, one of the things that I've been really involved in the last few years is outreach related to reducing political polarization, especially around climate change, because this is the kind of thing that can't really stay in the lab, I don't think. If you want to bring people together, it's great to research it, but at some point you also have to go out and try to do it. So my motivation for studying polarization of climate change is pretty simple. And that is, I think we have the following options for addressing climate change. We can do it together. If we're talking about changing all of society over decades, right? All our energy system, all our food system, we can either do that together in a democracy. We can not do it, or we can do it and undo it every 4 years. Or we could wreck democracy and we could hope that the dictator is a climate hawk. And economists and other folks have studied this. Dictators tend to be less environmentally concerned than democracies. And this may seem like somewhat of a joking and flippant suggestion, but for example, there was a forum last summer for the people who make scenarios for the IPCC, and one of the keynote speakers openly wondered, do we need to wreck democracy to fix climate change because it's not going fast enough? So I think the first option, do it together, is the only option that makes any sense and that has a chance of working. And I worry sometimes that we have a narrative or a discourse about climate change that sounds like, we need to change all of society all at once, and only a third of the Democratic Party can be trusted to do it. Even if that's true, it doesn't make sense and isn't going to happen. Okay, so now some key facts about US political polarization. Political polarization is now by far the most severe form of effective polarization. And effective polarization is basically about dislike. So how much do you dislike somebody from the outgroup in the context of intergroup conflict? So one measure of that shown here is a difference between in-group and out-group in a feeling thermometer. So you basically ask people, how do you feel on a scale of 0, I really hate them, to 100, I really like them, about different groups. And then you look at how do people rate their in-group compared to their out-group. So the bigger the difference, the stronger the effective polarization is in this measure. And so you can see that in the 1960s, race and religion were really strong measures of effective polarization that have declined dramatically since then. This actually stops at 2008, so these lines probably continue to go in the directions they're going. But politics, the difference between in-group, out-group on party has gone up. And you see that in lots of other measures. So, surveys that look at people's willingness to discriminate, people are by far more willing to discriminate in things like hiring against out-partisans than other kinds of out-groups like race and religion. There was one quite alarming survey that asked people, do you think we'd be better off as a country if large numbers of the opposing party just died? And I think 15% of Republicans and 20% of Democrats said yes. This is a headline from the New York Times today. Gut level hatred is consuming our political life, by Tom Edsall, reviewing some of the science. So polarization is really has really gotten to be bad and corrosive. And you can see, with January 6th, for example, many would argue the summer of 2020, that when polarization gets really bad, it's easy for democratic norms to be suspended, because even people who in an abstract way think they believe in democratic norms are so scared of the other side having power that they're willing to suspend their belief in democratic norms to prevent that. And so the effective polarization and the kinds of erosions that we've seen in trust in our institutions and in support and willingness to adhere to democratic norms, those things kind of go together. Okay, here's another key fact that I think surprises a lot of people, especially the top part of it. There's this narrative that you sometimes hear that polarization is really racial, that it's white people on the right and non-white people on the left. And it's actually not quite like that. So if you look at the political extremes, this is from the New York Times. So basically the top is the furthest to the left, the bottom is the furthest to the right. Both the furthest right and the furthest left people in the country are disproportionately white, educated, and affluent. And I think that surprises some people. A way to think about it is extremism is often destructive. And if you are privileged, then you have the option often to avoid the consequences of extremism, right? So there weren't during the summer of 2020, there weren't riots in affluent suburbs, right? But often when you're extreme, there is a incentive to be performative, to sort of to gain status by out ideologuing your fellow ideologues. And it turns out actually, even through history, it's a very common feature of revolutions that they tend to be driven by disaffected elites, not disaffected masses. Okay, this is from another survey showing the same thing about the extremes being rich, white, and educated. But the thing that I want to draw your attention to here is they've clustered. So they basically clustered people based on polls and a whole bunch of issues into these clusters of kind of types of ideologies, right? So there's these 7 types of ideologies that you see in the country. And then they look at, okay, which are the ones on each side that really separate themselves on some issues compared to everybody else? And they call those the wings. And the thing I want to draw your attention to is that the right wing is about 25% of the country and the left wing is about 8% of the country. And that's a really important difference, because it means that the right wing is a really potent force in primaries, right? If you think that like registered Republicans are something like 30% of the country, 25% of the country are the right wing, right? That's a hard group to get past in a Republican primary. And so that group's going to have a lot of power in Republican politics. And I'm going to come back to the importance of that in a second. The second thing is, and I think this is another thing that surprises a lot of people in universities, the median voter is an economically progressive, socially conservative, and not a college grad. I think a lot of people in universities think that the median voter is an economic conservative and a social progressive. It turns out that it's mostly it's a small group of people who are elites who are like that. This is sorry, each of these dots is an American voter from the U.S. voter study, the voter study group in 2016. The color indicates who they voted for. And this is, how liberal or conservative you are in the economic dimension and how liberal or conservative you are on the social dimension. If this surprises you, a couple of good heuristics for it might be, if you think about like social progressivism versus economic progressivism, which if you're a working class or poor person without a college degree, which are you more likely to like? Economic policies designed to help your bottom line, or economic policies designed to impose the cultural preferences of predominantly the rich on you? Another one would be, there's a lot of voters in the US that are religious. I can't remember if the median voter is religious, but I want to say that it is. And so again, that's going to correlate more with social conservatism than with economic conservatism. Okay, so to recap, the right wing is a bit bigger than the left wing, such that it's more of a potent force in primaries than the left wing is. The median voter is economically progressive and socially conservative. So if you see, the Democrats running in elections on economics and the right running elections on culture or critical race theory, et cetera. That makes a lot of sense politically, whether you agree with it or not. So what are some of the consequences of that? The right wing's power is primarily in government, right? So this is a measure of, how much of the Democrats and Republicans moved over time. Kind of the lower down the graph you are, the more recent it is. How much more conservative, more liberal have they become? And you can see in both the House and the Senate, the Republicans have moved more to the right than the Democrats have moved to the left. And again, I interpreted this as being caused in large part by the fact that the Republican fringe is large enough that they're hard to get around in primaries. The left's power is the left wing's power is primarily in cultural institutions. So there's been this huge shift starting in a little bit before 2015 in focuses in a lot of major cultural institutions like universities, newspapers, et cetera, on progressive social justice concepts, for example. So this is the number of articles in the New York Times that mention social justice. This is the number that mention whiteness. There's a whole bunch of other measures like this that show this huge increase in focuses on these kind of progressive social issues around this time. But because the left wing is small, they can't even win primaries often. So progressive wing candidates lost, they lost mayoral races in Minneapolis. They lost a mayoral race in Buffalo to a write-in candidate. They lost an attorney general race in 2021 to a Republican in Seattle. Right? Think about that. Seattle's a pretty progressive stronghold, and yet the left wing is very dominant in a lot of cultural institutions. And that creates some tension, again, because the overall worldview is not very popular. So for example, this is a poll I just saw yesterday showing how over this time period that this focus in cultural institutions on these left-wing issues has increased. The trust in universities has gone down dramatically, and it's driven almost entirely by Republicans and also independents. And if you look at this, is another measure that's kind of related to this. So it's something like 3% of U.S. professors' donations that go to Republicans. The fraction of right-leaning academics that say that there's a hostile climate for their beliefs on campus is about 70% in the survey, and the fraction that say that they have been punished or threatened with punishment for their views is almost 40%. So if you sort of think that it's not super surprising that Republican trust in universities has gone from almost 60% 8 years ago to less than 20%. Okay, so that all kind of seems like bad news, but there's some good news, right? If you go back up to this one, the main point that this group More in Common was trying to make with this report called Hidden Tribes was that most people are in what they call the exhausted majority, and there's a lot more consensus among the public on issues than our culture wars would make it seem. So I had this great student named Renee Marshall who did some of this work with me, and so in 2020, it seemed like the world was on fire in terms of polarization. We decided to write this op-ed called the 2/3 majority platform, and our thought exercise was, if you had to make a presidential platform that only had policies that at least 2/3 of Americans supported, what could you do? Could you do anything? And the answer is you could do quite a lot. So some examples, you could have a $15 federal minimum wage. You could spend more on infrastructure. You could do some common sense police and gun reforms, ban chokeholds, background checks, but you would not cut police funding. More than 2/3 oppose that. In your immigration, right? We think of that as one of our hottest issues. But it turns out, more than 2/3 of people support more secure borders and more merit-based immigration, and also permanent status for DACA recipients. So again, it seems like this really divisive issue, but often the divisiveness is, if anything, more about emphasis, right, than it is about actual substantive disagreement. Do you emphasize this one more, or do you emphasize this one more? There's another one that I just mentioned in context with the recent Supreme Court decision. The Dobbs decision about abortion was an example of where the Supreme Court made a decision that was unpopular compared to Americans. Affirmative action, not so. 3/4 of Americans oppose considering race in hiring and admissions, and that's clear majorities across every racial ethnic group. So there's a lot of things we agree on. So let's talk about climate change. So one of the fascinating things that also I think surprises people about climate change polarization in the US is that it's actually quite recent. So in the late 1980s, the fraction of Democrats, independents, and Republicans that said that they were worried about climate change was basically the same across all three of those groups. My center did an event last year with Claudine Schneider, who's a member of Congress, who was a Republican from Rhode Island, who in the late 1980s tried to pass bipartisan climate legislation, and she had both Al Gore and Newt Gingrich as sponsors on her bill, if you can believe that, right? It's sort of hard to believe today, but that was possible in the late 1980s. The polarization then increases, right, up to today, partly driven by the Democrats becoming more worried, but slightly more driven by Republicans becoming less worried. And maybe this graph stops a few years ago, but there's a few signs that maybe somewhat, a little bit, not a ton, but a little bit of the polarization has reduced since 2015, which I'll show in a second. That's interesting because, as I was just showing the graphs earlier, the culture war polarization has supercharged since 2015. So it's interesting that climate is kind of going the other direction. But the other thing I just want to show you here on the right is that this is measuring the difference between Democrat and Republican support for spending. So basically, the more negative or positive you are in this graph, the more polarized the issue is, the more different Republicans and Democrats see it. And again, you can see that the environment went from being one of the least polarized to being one of the most polarized over this time period. Okay, here are some signs of growing bipartisan consensus and the need to take more action. By the way, I don't have the chat open, so I'll look at that at the end. But if anyone has like a burning question and wants to raise their hand, feel free to, or just shout it out. Feel free to go ahead. Or
I'll interrupt you if I see something come through the chat.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so here are a couple of encouraging graphs, right? So this on the left is showing what are the fraction that agree, a percentage of people that agree that wind and solar development should be a larger priority than fossil fuels. You can see that Republican and Republican leaners get over 60% by 2020. And obviously a huge majority of Democrat leaners agree. If you ask what fraction favor to taking steps to be carbon neutral by 2050, everybody except for conservative Republicans agrees by roughly 2/3 or more. So there's a pretty strong consensus that we should be doing something on climate change. I really like this graph. This is showing what fraction of Americans think that Congress should do more to address global warming. And so if it's orange, it's over 50%, and it's orange almost everywhere. If it's kind of slightly dark orange, it's over 60%. And I really love to point out that right here is Lauren Boebert's district, with about 60% of people thinking Congress should be doing more about climate change. And somewhere over here is Marjorie Taylor Greene's district, again with a majority thinking that Congress should be doing more about climate change. So there's a lot more support for climate action, even in some of these districts that we think are deep red. And part of that reason might have to do with I think it basically comes down to two things. One is that the impacts of climate change in a lot of places are becoming more obvious. Unfortunately, tornadoes is actually not, or maybe unfortunately is the wrong word, but tornadoes are, the IPCC does not have strong evidence that tornadoes are being affected by climate change in terms of their frequency and severity. But certainly lots of other things are. So flooding in the southeast, drought in the west, fire in the west, heat waves obviously everywhere. And so those kinds of things are becoming easier and easier to see, and therefore harder to ignore, right? So you go to Western Colorado, which is very conservative. Everyone still cares about and wants to talk about water scarcity because that's a huge issue for the ranching and agriculture out there. And then the other thing is that the economics of renewable energy is becoming better and better, and often renewable energy is cheaper than fossil energy. And so again, there's huge business opportunities. And where you're going to put solar and wind, I'll show this more precisely in a second, but usually you put solar and wind in rural places, which tend to be disproportionately conservative. So the Republican districts actually stand to benefit disproportionately from bills like the IRA, which is, the Inflation Reduction Act. Another thing that's really interesting is younger conservatives want action. So this is looking at environmental, right? So percent of adults who say, you know, climate change is having some effect in their community, and these are all among Republicans. And blue is younger and green is older. And you can see there's this big spread, right? Where for this is more oil, but if you look at, you know, more nuclear or more wind, right? Younger people want more solar. Young people want more. We need government regulations to encourage reliance on renewable energy. U.S. should prioritize alternative energy sources. That's 80% of young Republicans. And so that group is only going to get bigger just by demographics. And Republicans are starting to become aware of that. So there's this group, which I'll mention in a second, called the Conservative Climate Caucus, which has become one of the biggest caucuses in the House of Representatives. It's all Republicans who want their party to come to the table on climate change. And they were inspired to start that group. It was a representative named John Curtis from Utah who started that group. And he was partly inspired by talking to activists from this group called the American Conservation Coalition, which is an NGO made up of young conservatives who want the Republican Party to be more serious on climate and want the conservative climate solutions to be at the table. Here's another thing. This is from hot off the presses from a study I'm working on right now. Climate change is becoming a big election issue for Republicans, and the thing that we're trying to figure out is how big of an election issue is it? And this is a graph that really illustrates this, right? So this is just independent voters from this survey data that we were able to get from the voter study group, and this is the importance of climate change. So if you think that climate change is very important, let's move there we go. If you think climate change is very important, there's a 93% chance if you're an independent that you voted for Joe Biden. And if you look at it's true that Trump maybe had a uniquely hostile position to climate action, but the numbers are actually pretty similar in 2020 for the Senate and for the House. And then the other thing is that this group that thinks that the importance of climate change is very important is getting bigger, right? So if this continues to be this strong of a predictor of voting for the Democrats, again, this is just independent voters. And this group gets bigger, you can see how that's going to be an election problem for Republicans, unless they can come up with a platform that kind of decouples importance of climate from wanting to vote for the Republicans. Some climate policies that we found have more than 2/3 popular support: taxing corporate emissions, various things related to carbon capture, renewable portfolio standards. So policies that require utilities to hit a certain target. We have actually, my group has another study that's going to come out soon that looked at state level renewable portfolio standards, and we found that utilities are actually setting on slightly more ambitious targets in a lot of places than even the governments are holding them to, which again I think is encouraging, and reflects the economics, the improving economics of renewable energy. Net metering, so basically if you have solar on your roof and you make more than you need, you can sell it back to the grid. Fuel efficiency standards, restrictions on power plant emissions, and increasing solar and wind production. And these are just things that we can find in 2020. There's lots and lots of more climate policies or climate actions that have a lot of support. Now, it's not all good news. I'd say if I had to think of what are probably 3 of the biggest barriers to turning bipartisan popular support into policy. One is special interests. So 2 good books on this are Leah Stokes' Short Circuiting Policy and Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's Merchants of Doubt. So there are special interest groups that spend a lot of money trying to stop policies that are seen as harmful to fossil fuel interests. Now, one thing that's gonna help with that problem is the more renewable energies take off, the more that their lobbies become big too, right? And so you're seeing that, for example, in places like Texas and I think the Carolinas, where, for example, I saw Congresswoman Nancy Mace, who represents, I can't remember which, she's from, I think I want to say South Carolina, one of the Carolinas. She's a Republican, and I saw her on CNN talking about the debt ceiling bill, and the original Republican version was going to cut a lot of the subsidies and spending on renewables in the Inflation Reduction Act. And she kind of equivocated about whether she was willing to support it. And she explicitly said, solar and wind create a lot of jobs in my district, right? And so again, the more there's an economic powerhouse in renewables, the less the powerful and effective the fossil fuel lobby is going to be. So special interest is one. Apathy is the second one, right? So a large fraction of Americans want more done on climate change, but if you kind of ask people to rank what is your single most important issue, it's actually a very, very small number of people that say climate change. And so that means that climate change maybe as an election issue might fall off in some years compared to other issues. And then the third one is just that the primary politics, that the conservative Republicans, which are maybe the one group that that stand out as less interested in pursuing climate action, do have quite a lot of power in the Republican primaries, and that's and probably will for the foreseeable future. Okay, but some good news. Renee Marshall, my former student, and I, we looked at every state level climate bill, or bill that clearly had the intention of causing some decarbonization. We looked at all these state level bills from 2015 to 2020. We found that 30% of them were passed in states where the Republicans controlled at least two of the three branches of government, meaning that the House, the Senate, and the governor's mansion. And about a third of them were bipartisan. The other thing that I think is really interesting is the Republicans had a stronger preference for their own bills than Democrats. So Republican bills basically almost always passed virtually unanimously. Democrat bills, some passed unanimously, some passed basically on party lines. And so I think a takeaway from that for Republicans is you're going to lose elections if you do nothing. But if you bring your ideas to the table in good faith, you actually have a lot of bargaining power, because the Democrats will vote for your climate bills more than you'll vote for their climate bills. So if the Republicans can take the issue seriously, they have an opportunity, I think, to set the agenda. Whereas if they don't, then they just risk losing and letting the Democrats set the agenda. We looked at what are correlates of bipartisanship in state level bills. So we found that when they expand choice, that they're more likely to be bipartisan and have higher vote shares, meaning you kind of carrots, not sticks, is a good way to think about that, right? So expanding choice would be net metering, creating a subsidy for something that helps people do something new that they couldn't have done before, but doesn't tell people they can't do something that they could do before. The financial incentives a little bit, and then in terms of including aspects that related to inequality, ones that focused on we call economic justice or general progressivism, kind of inequality vaguely defined or defined in terms of class, actually were slightly more often bipartisan. The economic justice ones are over here, but framing it in terms of social justice, which we defined as either being explicitly not neutral with respect to an immutable characteristic, usually race, framed in terms of what you might think of as like sociology department social justice jargon, so words like marginalized, equity, environmental justice, those were almost never bipartisan. And I've had conversations with Republican staffers that back that up, that basically because of the culture wars and how divisive they become, and again how the Republicans have somewhat of an electoral advantage on the culture wars, they often are hesitant to touch bills that use words that they think are kind of coded towards progressive activist academia. Another thing we did was we did a survey study. So we took about 2,500 participants that were nationally representative on race, sex, and age, and then 50-50 on liberal conservative ideology. And we looked at how much do they support different climate policies, either alone or paired with some other policy. And this is based on there are a lot of debates right now about should you pair, for example, there's a bill called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act that died in committee, that was bipartisan, and the idea was we pause new EPA regulations in addition to having a carbon tax, and that's going to bring Republicans on board. Obviously, there's bills like the bipartisan infrastructure law that pair climate with infrastructure, and then there's various climate justice, environmental justice bills that, you know, Green New Deal type ideas that either pair with economic progressivism. So we tried, you know, these 4 different types of economic progressivism, or these different social justice policies. And again, why are we separating these two? Because the median voter is economically progressive and socially conservative. And so our hypothesis was that, just like we saw with the bills, that voters would treat these two very differently. And that's basically what we found. So we found that if you pair with pausing regulation to try to win Republicans, you actually don't win Republicans, but you lose Democrats and you lose independents. And if you pair with social justice, you don't win Democrats, but you lose independents. It's actually interesting that you don't lose Republicans significantly, but you do lose independents significantly. Maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A. It's kind of a interesting nuance in our data. But again, it speaks to the fact that the median voter, you know, likes economic progressivism, does not like social justice. When you pair with economic redistribution, this wasn't a statistically significant effect, but we do find a small increase in support among Democrats and no change among independents and Republicans. And there was another study done by Paris Burgess and Matto Mildenberger and Leo Stokes that found a similar thing, just looking at economically progressive policies where it was significant, where basically Democrats liked it more and nobody else liked it less. So our conclusion from this is bundling should be done cautiously, and kind of the 2 most common strategies for bundling, you know, try to bring in Republicans with a conservative policy, or try to do an environmental justice policy. Both have potential cost to support, even though it may be that popularity is not the main driver of wanting to do environmental justice policies, and that's fine. Our results don't say that that's a wrong motivation.
Before you move on, we have a couple clarifying questions on just the couple of recent things you talked about. One, does the term climate change being linked to a bill make it partisan? Or are you just talking about like the social justice?
All of these. Yeah. So all of these go down, right? So because these are climate alone in blue, or climate with something else, Republicans support all of them less than Democrats do because of the climate part. Right.
So it's not just the social justice or the
no, you're right. The social justice,
okay,
you know, loses independence compared to climate alone, and loses Republicans a little bit, but not significantly.
And there was one a couple slides ago. You mentioned, was it?
It has a 30% on it. One more back, I think.
Yeah, I think it was one more back.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was this
So
these were just climate change bills, right?
Yeah, these are right. We do not include, I don't know if this is the question, but we do not include bills that are bad for climate change, like bills that are repealing, you know, that are like repealing some renewable energy thing, or, you know what I mean? So these are only bills that have the clear intention of advancing decarbonization.
Later, maybe if you can address, like I'm in Oregon, we're trying to pass a climate change education bill, and it was seen as partisan because of the use of the word climate change. I would love later your advice on how to make that less partisan in nature so that it would appeal to others, maybe just in the way we give it a name. But
yeah, we can talk about that. I think that there's yeah, that's a great thing to talk about. And I think the good news is that the degree to which climate change is partisan, I think, is decreasing somewhat. And if climate communicators play their cards right, it could decrease even faster. But yeah, that's a great question. We'll come back to. So other recent developments. So you know, the bipartisan solution caucuses formed in the House and the Senate. Some of what they talk about is climate change. The House has a conservative climate caucus with, I think, over 70, about a third of the House GOP. I think it's over 70 members. There was the COVID spending bill that included in the 2021 bipartisan infrastructure climate spending was a big part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, and the COVID relief bill that came out in the December 2020, I think. And then, of course, the CHIPS and Science Act was a climate-related bill that was bipartisan. Even the IRA was not bipartisan, but had elements that, you know, had the elements of bipartisanship that we're seeing in our research. And I suspect that that's going to be a reason why it's going to be hard, if not impossible, for the Republicans to repeal. My anecdote about Nancy Mace being an example of that. I think there's a big role of technology in a bipartisan approach, right? So everybody likes technology, everybody likes research and development, everybody likes jobs, everybody likes infrastructure. Those things are mostly bipartisan. Patriotism and international competitiveness are popular and mostly bipartisan, right? We don't want China to win the renewable technology race. I'm going to come back to patriotism in a second because I think there's an important message there for educators. Research and development spending is a high economic multiplier. It's good for the economy. Government money spent in research and development tends to generate, more than $1, and $1 spent on research and development tends to generate more than $1 in economic activity. And then this is a huge one, right? Renewable energy generation is disproportionately in Republican districts. In fact, Kevin McCarthy's district is number 2 in the country for renewable energy generation, planned and operational capacity. So there's a huge economic incentive for the Republicans to not block some of these bills, which again is, I suspect, why the Biden administration was able to keep almost all of the IRA's spending in the debt ceiling deal. This is just a visualization of that, right? So if you look at capacity for clean technology capacity, where is it? Again, most of it, there's some in blue and some in red, but the majority of it, the clear majority of it, is in red districts and in red states, right? So there's a ton of it in Texas. There's quite a lot of it in Florida. There's, here's Kevin McCarthy's district over here, right? There's a lot of it in kind of the red parts of California. Okay, so key takeaways so far. I think we need to work together to address climate change at the very least, because I don't think there's another choice if we're serious about trying to change the whole economy. There are opportunities to work together. So there have been some recent bipartisan federal bills. There have been over 100 enacted bipartisan state level bills. There's lots of financial and electoral incentives, and the electoral incentives for Republicans to get serious are growing, and they're already large, as we saw. And the bipartisan energy around climate change tends to disproportionately expand choice, use carrots rather than sticks, and use economic rather than social justice frames for inequality. And then climate change polarization may be decreasing somewhat since 2015, at least by some measures it seems to be, despite the fact that cultural polarization has massively increased since 2015. And so the takeaway I would take from that is, if climate change is a priority, we should separate it from the culture wars. So if we're liberals, we should not try to pass climate policy that makes conservatives think that we're trying to backdoor in ideas that they might consider woke. And then the other thing that I think is potentially encouraging is that collaboration towards shared objectives reduces intergroup conflict. This is one of the most widely known findings in social psychology. And so what that suggests is, if we could bring the parties together on climate change, that might actually reduce the temperature generally, right? If the more issues that we have that are uniting, it actually lowers the temperature on other issues that are unrelated, that are dividing, right? If we can unite around a economically optimistic, infrastructure, technology focused climate decarbonization strategy that also emphasizes our American exceptionalism and competitiveness and leading the world in this transition, kind of like we did in the space race, that might actually lower the temperature on, I think, these other issues. At least that's my hypothesis. Okay, here's some advice for having better conversations. I show these points to my, I have a class that called Sustainable Economies, where we talk about various kind of debated issues in the environmental climate space. And so here are the good things I think to teach students for how to have better conversations. So one is steel manning, as opposed the opposite of straw manning. So if you're going to disagree with somebody, before you do, try to articulate the strongest version of their argument that you can. The most charitable version of the argument that you can. And that's also going to make you disagree more effectively, in addition to make the other person feel respected. One of the big traps, I think, in polarized conversations is that we don't distinguish objectives from strategies and constraints, right? So for example, often it's the case that, both parties want economic growth, right? And they disagree on, whether we should raise taxes or cut taxes in a particular time, right? Whether raising or cutting taxes is a strategy, whether that increases or decreases growth at a particular time, somebody's right and somebody's wrong about that, right? Depending on the tax. But it's a lot more productive to have that conversation if you sort of acknowledge at the beginning that we actually have the same objectives. Or sometimes we don't have the same objectives. And then it just, and those are things that are intractable, but at least you can kind of acknowledge them and put them aside. So I think a good example of where people just don't agree on objectives is the abortion debate, right? There's the people who are pro-choice, emphasize women's rights, women's autonomy. Usually people who are against abortion emphasize, the rights of unborn children, right? That's ultimately a difference in emphasis. There's not going to be a set of facts that's going to get around that, just that there's a difference in emphasis and objectives there.
Hola mamá, buenos días. Ya comimos yo, Manuel y yo cereal.
Same thing, sorry.
Y ya le di a él su medicina con un yogur líquido.
Katie, can you mute whoever's unmuted there? I'm getting
I just did, yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And then constraints is the same thing, right? If somebody says, we should do this, and somebody else says, it's impossible. That whether or not it's impossible is a fact question that you can use, the scientific method to try to understand and recognize that you might agree on the objectives. Engaging slow thinking. Have any of you heard of the book Thinking Fast and Slow? Yeah, so it's basically it's this idea that some of our cognitive processes are fast and automatic, and we don't think about it. Like when we're walking, we don't think, okay, now I'm going to move my left foot, now I'm going to move my right foot. Right, we just do it. Whereas like if you're doing a math problem, it's absorbing your cognitive energy. And a lot of our biases come from fast thinking, right? So one of the things that we do when we're thinking fast is we stereotype people, and we stereotype arguments, right? We hear something we don't like. Oh, this person must be this, right? And so the more we can engage slow thinking when we're having conversations with people, the more that we can find, the areas of common ground. Cultivate intellectual humility. It turns out it's a mathematical fact that if you think you know everything with certainty, then the value of information is zero, right? There's no reason to learn if you know everything. And so a big part of learning things, but also having better conversations with people you disagree with, is being open to the possibility that you don't know everything and that you might be wrong about something. If you think society should take a particular policy, there's a study from the Leeds School of Business here a few years ago that found that people moderate their views if you ask them to explain how their policies would work. The way I put this to my students is, these are serious issues, take them seriously, right? So if you're saying we need to, change your whole energy system, then if we're actually going to do that well, we have to have a very careful, well thought out plan for doing that. We can't just, say, ban coal tomorrow, right? That sounds great, but that would be 60% of China's energy that comes offline and massive increases in poverty. Be kind and seek out stories involving people being kind to one another. So there's studies that find that if you prime people with stories of kindness, then they behave more pro-socially with each other. Treat your peers with respect, which I think means trying to avoid both giving and taking unnecessary offenses. And I think in universities, we understand this part, and I think we're working on understanding this part. And then remembering that hearing that ideas that you disagree with or object to makes you stronger, not weaker. And this is anti-fragility is a concept that occurs in all different parts of life. So your bones, when you go into space, your bones get weaker because walking around and straining them is partly what builds your bone density. People who grow up with a dishwasher are much more likely to have allergies because being exposed to germs strengthens your immune system. And same thing, there's increasing evidence that this is also true for people intellectually and emotionally. People who are taught that, anytime they hear something they disagree with or don't like, they should tell some authority, and that authority can, stop it or make it go away, are going to tend to have higher incidences of mental illness. And as I'll show in a second, the youth mental health crisis is really bad, and it's become partisan. So it's become much more severe among liberals than conservatives. And some people who study this think that this is why, that basically we don't, or one of the reasons why we don't, progressive discourses are too often teaching people that, if you ever hear something you disagree with, it's society's fault, and an authority should be allowed to make it go away. Here's another thing, be precise and stick to the science, right? So if you're talking to somebody who's skeptical of climate change, now there's people who say that if you're talking to people who are, kind of knee-jerk skeptical, just don't bother. People call them the dismissives. That's a, even a subset of conservative Republicans, and they probably can't be reached easily. But people who are kind of on the fence are going to respond better if you stick to the facts and kind of don't exaggerate the facts. And I would say relatedly, avoid histrionics. So when the IRA negotiation was happening and it looked like Manchin might block it, John Podesta said, "It seems odd that Manchin would choose as his legacy to be the one man who single-handedly doomed humanity." And it's like, the IRA passing or not, I like the IRA. It's a good bill, right? I'm glad it passed. But the difference between the IRA passing and not is not the difference between the apocalypse happening and not, right? And so if you say stuff like that, you just make it harder for people who are not already on your team to take you seriously. And then gets back to the question earlier. Connect to others' values and meet them where they are, right? So maybe, and Katie mentioned this earlier too, right? Maybe people don't want to talk about climate change, but maybe they want to talk about drought and water scarcity, right? Or maybe they want to talk about fire management. John Curtis, who I mentioned earlier, who started the Conservative Climate Caucus, he co-chairs the Western Wildfire Caucus with Joe Neguse, who's our Democratic congressman here in Boulder. So there's lots of opportunities to do that. And again, jobs, right? Technology, right? We want to lead the world on renewable technology and batteries. And all these other things and minerals. And in fact, there are some opportunities to take, I think, important opportunities to take what are traditionally conservative ideas and harness them for climate. So, we need to build things much faster. Like, it can't take 15 years to have a NEPA review for transmission lines if we're going to decarbonize our economy fast. And so that's, reducing regulations is then something that's kind of in the conservative wheelhouse. And again, be hopeful. I think people don't respond. People respond to doom with either paralysis if they believe you, or kind of dismissive if they don't and they think you're being histrionic. And doom is actually not, climate change is a very serious problem, but doom is not consistent with the evidence. So the deaths from natural disasters, per capita have fallen dramatically. I think the average in 2020, 2021, 2022 globally was 12,000 deaths from natural disasters per year. That's about half of how many people are killed in the US alone by murder. So we're making a lot of progress on adaptation. Same thing with damages. So if you look at climate damages as a percentage of exposed GDP, so like if you look at, billion-dollar disasters are going up, but most of that is actually that there's more stuff in the way as our economy gets richer. If you look at what fraction of GDP kind of within a particular radius of particular types of disasters gets damaged, it's going down everywhere, and it's actually going down faster in low-income countries than in high-income countries. Again, this is good news. It doesn't mean that climate change is not real. It just means that we're adapting, and that's a good thing. We should keep doing that. So some work that from my group and others have found that the path that we're on is we're clearly not on the kind of 4 and 5 degree path that we thought we were on 8 to 10 years ago. The path that we're on now is something between 2 and 2.5 degrees probably, and the 2 degree is within reach maybe if we get our act together. The world has also just gotten a lot better by a bunch of different measures. So, almost everybody was poor 200 years ago, and now less than 10% of the world is poor. Democracy, basically wasn't a thing before the Industrial Revolution in terms of percentage of the population, and that's gone way up. And I'm not going to read all of these, but you can see the point that there's a lot of macro trends that are going way, way, way up. And again, not evenly, right? We've rich countries have gained more than poor countries, but there have been gains almost everywhere. So I think the child mortality, for example, in low-income countries fell by 2/3 since 1990, which is incredible. And actually, there is a trend towards economic inequality across countries now, that the rich countries on average are growing slower than poorer countries, except for like really poor countries. One reason I think this is really important for educators is that there's evidence that especially kids in rich, not just kids, everybody in rich countries take this for granted. So this is a survey that asked people, in the last 20 years, has the proportion of the world living in extreme poverty decreased, increased, or remained the same? Decreased is the correct answer, right? It's an empirical fact that the extreme poverty has decreased in the last 20 years. And what they found here is the richer the country was, the smaller the fraction of people that got it right. So basically, people are kind of more pessimistic the richer they are. Some of this may be, this is another study that basically showed the same thing. Some of this may be that growth is slower in rich countries recently, and so maybe progress isn't as obvious in the US as it is in China in the last, say, 20 years. But I think part of it is also privilege, right? It's we in rich countries have the privilege to take progress for granted, and virtue signal about how we need to upend all of society, because that increases our status, like on Twitter or something, right? And we don't have to live with the consequences of actually doing it, because we have a pretty stable, we're very lucky to be in a pretty stable society. Back to two things that I think this is related to, that I think is relevant for teachers. Most Americans are patriotic, but it's negatively correlated with climate, being concerned about climate, right? So this is just showing from two different studies, Republicans, Independents, and Democrats. Basically, the more worried you are about climate change, the less likely you are to say you're extremely proud to be American. And again, if you want to mobilize all of society, I think there's pretty good evidence and pretty good reasons to believe that that's only going to be possible in a society that believes in itself, and in a society that has trust in its institutions, which I would argue, patriotism is part of, at least to define this way. I know that there are ways to define patriotism that are more partisan. The second thing is mental health of young people is a crisis. And so overselling doom is not a costless thing, right? So this is emergency room visits for self-inflicted injuries. It's gone way up, especially for girls, since the early 2000s. Some of that is social media, but some of that is some of these doomist messages on social media. So 4 in 10 young people now say they don't want to have children because they're afraid of climate change, and 45% in the same survey said that climate change affects their daily life and functioning. As I mentioned earlier, mental health of young people is increasingly a liberal crisis. So more female than male. So the fraction, this is one of the most alarming statistics I've seen in a long time. The fraction of liberal women between ages of 18 and 35 that say they've been diagnosed with a mental health condition is over 50%. Over 50%. And why Musa Al-Gharbi has this really good article in American Affairs that talks about all the different possibilities for why that might be. And this kind of, doom and gloom narrative, avoid ideas you disagree with, is probably part of it, although social media is also probably part of it. So don't take it from me, take it from a young, excellent climate activist named Hannah Ritchie. She's the deputy director, I think, of Our World in Data and the head of their environment group. And she has this great article in Wired saying, "Stop telling kids they'll die from climate change." And she has a new book coming out called Not the End of the World that basically says, look, we need to get things done. And the way to get things done and the way to inspire people to get things done is not to make them depressed by telling them often exaggerated doom and gloom. The other thing is, I would really encourage you to teach kids to embrace nuance and rigor and avoid simplistic tribal solutions. I think we take for granted often in environmental discourse the idea that it's dangerous to minimize the problem of climate change, but it's not dangerous to catastrophize it. And I agree that it's dangerous to minimize it, but I think it's also probably dangerous to catastrophize it. And there are historical examples that I think provide good analogies. So one is the book, The Population Bomb, which came out in 1968 and predicted that because of overpopulation, that basically there would be all these cataclysms, like Britain would cease to exist in the year 2000, and hundreds of millions of people would starve. 65 million Americans, I think, would die, was one of the predictions. That book motivated a bunch of eugenic policies, including in China, and caused maybe 100 million coerced abortions. disproportionately of girls. So a really, really bad thing. And of course, the predictions of the book were wrong. In Sri Lanka recently, the president, who was a Berkeley educated guy, was like, all steeped in the organic is better, and banned synthetic fertilizer in Sri Lanka and caused a hunger and economic crisis in his country, and then had to walk it back. But the damage was already done. And then, of course, this is one that I think educators need to remember. I'm pretty sure it's the case that one of the most, if not the most, assigned textbooks in education schools is Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which, if you read it carefully, it praises and positively cites Mao's Cultural Revolution. And yet communism is by far the deadliest force in human history. And so, if we teach our students that they should be so afraid of climate change that they should flirt with ideas like communism, or ideas like banning synthetic fertilizer, or even ideas like banning coal overnight, which, like I said, is about 60% of China's energy, we run the risk of doing a lot of damage, both to their mental health and to the world. So some parting thoughts to my conservative friends: what can make America greater than leading the clean energy economy? And also, you're going to lose elections if you don't take this stuff more seriously. To my liberal friends, this climate change is really an emergency. We should be willing to work with anyone and make compromises to solve it. And to everyone, we face a major challenge with climate change, but we live in one of the greatest societies by any measure that has ever existed. Let's act like we believe in ourselves. Thank you.
Boom.
Sorry, that was a little bit longer than last year. Sorry.
No, that's so great. Thank you so much, Matt. This was really informative, and I really appreciate the end of bringing it back to hopeful messaging and all of that. We do have a break after this, so I do want to allow time for a break, but people did have a couple of questions that I thought were important, so, and actually relate to what you just talked about. Two of them were came up when you were talking about polling and how, like, in these Republican, districts, that people were, were worried about climate change or wanted climate change policies. And somebody asked, do the elected officials, are the elected officials in any party sort of aware of some of these findings that you're talking about today? I think it's a general question, but I just wanted you to know that was when it was brought up as a question.
Yeah.
And I think similarly, someone else asked, how do we get the media to know about some of this stuff? And, so yeah, just kind of like, what is the culture in the elected officials and media, and trying to kind of put this information out there? I know you do a lot of work to try to communicate this stuff, but.
So great question. I mean, I guess the short answer is yes. I and some other people in this area are trying hard to get this message out there to everybody, who needs to hear it, which certainly includes, Republican politicians. I would say also Democrat politicians, and certainly the media. That's one of the reasons why we're doing this study now, to try to estimate the what precisely has been the electoral cost of climate inaction for the Republican Party's electoral chances, because we think that that's something that Republican politicians might pay attention to. That's probably all I'm willing to say at this point about that. But yes, you're absolutely right.
But they do look at polling, right? Like, they do look at polling. They do some of their own polling, yeah. But they look at other studies as well. So to some extent, that information can get communicated back to them.
Yeah, and right, and they do look a lot at polling. And I would say my impression from people that I've talked to is that the fact that the conservative Republicans are a powerful force in primaries, but also the fact that Republicans lose general elections on climate change, my sense is that a lot of Republicans are aware of both of those things, and they kind of obviously those can be somewhat in tension with each other, and different politicians kind of work around that in different ways.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I didn't see any other questions really come in as we were going. If anybody else does have one, please put it in. But we are at the break time, and I do want to allow for that. We'll have a 15-minute break, but there was a quick question around, and I asked you this last year, are you willing to share your slides with us that I could
Absolutely,
put in PDF form or whatever in the resources folder I'm starting? And also, a lot of people really wanted to be able to share this information with other people that they work with. Is that something that you'd be okay if they shared some,
Absolutely.
like shared the information, shared your slides with others?
In fact, last year, you know, it's okay with all you to do this again. Last year you sent me the video and I put it on my website, and I think that a few people shared it kind of that way, so they could see the whole thing. I'm happy to do that also, if that's okay with you, Katie, and everyone else.
Yeah, so I've been recording. I have this, I'll have the video, so I'll put the video in our folder, and I'm happy to share that with you as well. And then if you send me the slides, I'll put that in our folder, and yeah, folks can share as much as they want. I'm happy for that as well. So cool.
Yeah. Thanks so much, everyone. Seems like a really awesome group, and really appreciate you having me, Katie.
Thank you. Thank you for joining. I love starting the day with this. I think it's such a nice, nice message of like, you know, yes, we're getting more polarized, and at the same time, we can work together, and the messaging is important. So I think it's a really nice way to start our day. I appreciate you joining us. And yeah, if other people do have questions, I have Matt's email and things like that, so we can always answer those later. So thank you all so much.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
really
Matt.
Nice to meet you
and
all.
then, yeah, we'll take a 15-minute break, and we'll come back at whatever time zone you're in, 15 to the hour in about 13 minutes.
Thanks, everybody.